What would you have done if you were in Lucas's shoes? Do you think it's a millionaire CEO hadn't touched a woman in 20 years, but his new assistant changed everything? The silence in the penthouse was thick, heavier than the plush velvet drapes that lined the floor-to-ceiling windows. Arthur Kendrick, a man whose name echoed through the city's financial district, hadn't touched a woman in 20 years. Not a gentle caress, not a comforting hug, nothing. It was an unspoken vow, a self-imposed exile from the warmth of human contact. People whispered, some pitied, others mocked, but Arthur remained an enigma, a fortress of solitude built from cold, hard cash and colder memories. Tonight, however, the fortress was about to crack. His new assistant, a whirlwind of vibrant energy named Ilara, had just walked into his life, and with her a challenge that felt like a seismic tremor. 20 years, Arthur? She'd asked, her eyes sparkling with a mix of curiosity and something else, something he couldn't quite place. That's a long time. He'd merely grunted, turning back to the city lights, the millions of tiny, indifferent lives twinkling below. Little did he know, Ilara's seemingly innocent question was the fuse to a dynamite charge, one that would shatter his carefully constructed world and force him to confront the ghosts he'd buried deep within. Arthur Kendrick wasn't just a millionaire, he was a titan. His company, Kendrick Industries, was a sprawling empire built on cutting-edge technology and ruthless business acumen. At 55, he was a man carved from granite, his face a landscape of sharp angles and deep lines, etched by years of solitude and relentless ambition. His self-imposed isolation stemmed from a tragedy 2 decades ago, a loss so profound it had frozen his heart, turning it into a fortress. He'd thrown himself into his work, using the relentless pursuit of success as a shield against the pain. Ilara Vance, his new assistant, was the antithesis of everything Arthur represented. At 28, she was a vibrant force of nature, her laughter a melody in the sterile, silent corridors of Kendrick Industries. She had a way of looking at him, not with fear or awe, but with a disarming directness that made him uneasy. She was hired through a temp agency, a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Arthur's previous assistants couldn't withstand his cold demeanor and demanding schedule. Ilara, however, seemed immune. Their initial interactions were a clash of polar opposites, Arthur with his curt commands and icy glares, and Ilara with her cheerful efficiency and persistent attempts to engage him in conversation. "Mr. Kendrick," she'd say, her voice bright, "your 2 p.m. meeting is rescheduled, and by the way, that tie is a crime against fashion." Arthur would merely grunt, dismissing her with a wave of his hand, but Ilara persisted, her presence a constant, subtle disruption to his carefully constructed world. She saw past the icy exterior, sensing the pain beneath, a vulnerability he'd long since buried, and that, more than anything, threatened the walls he'd built around himself. The tension in the Kendrick Industries penthouse was palpable. Ilara, despite Arthur's frosty demeanor, continued to chip away at his defenses. She'd leave small, thoughtful notes on his desk, not about work, but about a new art exhibit or a particularly beautiful sunset. She'd bring in pastries from her favorite bakery, insisting he try just one. Arthur, initially dismissive, found himself begrudgingly acknowledging her efforts. He'd catch himself glancing at the notes, his eyes lingering just a moment too long. He'd take a bite of the pastry, his taste buds surprised by the burst of flavor. One evening, Arthur found himself working late, the city lights painting the office in a surreal glow. Ilara was still there, organizing files, her humming a soft melody. "You don't have to stay," he said, his voice gruff. "I can handle this." "I know," she replied, her smile warm, "but I like it here. Besides, someone has to make sure you don't work yourself to death." Arthur scoffed, but a flicker of something akin to amusement crossed his face. He found himself drawn into a conversation, something he hadn't done in years. They talked about everything and nothing, her love for old movies, his passion for architecture, the city's ever-changing skyline. As the hours passed, the ice around Arthur's heart began to thaw ever so slightly. However, the change wasn't without its challenges. Arthur's old habits were deeply ingrained. He'd still snap at her, his impatience flaring up when things didn't go his way. Ilara, in turn, wouldn't back down. She'd meet his anger with a calm assertiveness, refusing to be intimidated. "Mr. Kendrick," she'd say, her voice firm, "you're not going to talk to me like that." Their interactions became a dance of push and pull, a constant negotiation of boundaries. Arthur found himself both irritated and intrigued by her defiance. He was used to people bending to his will, but Ilara was different. She challenged him, forced him to confront the parts of himself he'd long suppressed. One day a major deal was on the line, and the pressure was immense. Arthur, overwhelmed by stress, lashed out at Ilara, accusing her of incompetence. He said things he immediately regretted, words that cut through the air like shards of ice. Ilara, her eyes filled with hurt, didn't respond. She simply gathered her things and walked out. Arthur was left alone in the silent office, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. He realized, with a jolt, that he had pushed her too far. He'd seen the pain in her eyes, the same pain he'd carried for 20 years. He'd become the very thing he despised, a cold, unfeeling tyrant. He found himself pacing the office, his mind racing. He had to apologize, but how? He wasn't used to admitting his mistakes, to showing vulnerability. He hesitated, then picked up his phone, dialing her number. "Ilara," he said, his voice rough, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean what I said." "It's okay, Mr. Kendrick," she replied, her voice distant. "I understand." "No, you don't," he said. "I was wrong. I let my anger get the better of me." There was a long pause, then Ilara spoke. "You know, Mr. Kendrick," she said softly, "you don't have to be like this." Her words hit him like a physical blow. He knew she was right. He'd built a wall around himself, but it was a prison, not a sanctuary. He wanted to change, but he didn't know how. The following day, Ilara returned to the office. The air was thick with unspoken emotions. Arthur, determined to make amends, apologized again, this time with sincerity. He told her about his past, about the tragedy that had shaped him, about the pain he'd carried for 20 years. Ilara listened, her eyes filled with empathy. As he spoke, a weight lifted from his shoulders, a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying. He felt a sense of release, a glimmer of hope. He looked at Ilara, her eyes filled with understanding, and he knew that something had shifted between them. The atmosphere in the office had shifted. A fragile truce had been established, a delicate balance between Arthur's guarded heart and Ilara's persistent warmth. They began to spend more time together, not just in the office, but outside as well. Arthur, at Ilara's urging, started to explore the city again, rediscovering the joy he'd long forgotten. They went to art galleries, attended concerts, and even took a spontaneous trip to the coast. One evening they found themselves at a small, intimate jazz club. The music was soulful, the atmosphere electric. As the night wore on, Arthur found himself drawn to Ilara, her laughter a melody that resonated deep within him. He felt a connection he hadn't experienced in decades, a spark of something that felt both familiar and new. As they walked back to his penthouse, Ilara stopped, her gaze fixed on him. "Arthur," she began, her voice soft, "there's something I need to tell you." He looked at her, his heart pounding. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "My name isn't Ilara Vance." He frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "My name is Ilara Kendrick." The words hit him like a physical blow, a shockwave that sent tremors through his entire being. "Kendrick," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she said, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm your daughter." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at her, his mind reeling, trying to process the impossible. "My daughter?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Your daughter," she confirmed. My mother was Sarah. She never stopped loving you. She wanted me to find you. She knew you were hurting." Arthur's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of his past. Sarah was the woman he loved, the one he tragically lost 20 years ago. He had always believed she died without any children. Now he was face to face with his own daughter. "But how?" he stammered. "How did you find me?" "My mother left me a letter," Alara explained. "She told me about you, about your company, about the pain you carried. She wanted me to help you, to bring you back to life." The revelation was overwhelming, a tidal wave of emotions crashing over him. He felt a mix of shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. He had missed 20 years of his daughter's life, 20 years he could never get back. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted you to see me as Alara, not just as your daughter," she replied. "I wanted you to know me, to understand me." He looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I had no idea." "It's okay," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm here now." The truth hung in the air, a heavy, bitter-sweet revelation. Arthur felt a sense of both profound loss and overwhelming joy. He had found his daughter, but he had also lost 20 years. The weight of his past, the years of isolation and pain, seemed to intensify, but now there was a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption. The revelation of Alara's true identity changed everything. Arthur, reeling from the shock, began to see his life in a new light. The years of isolation, the self-imposed exile, felt like a wasted lifetime. He had been so consumed by his grief that he had missed out on the most precious gift of all, family. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions. Arthur and Alara spent hours talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other. He learned about her childhood, her dreams, her passions. He discovered a vibrant, intelligent woman, a reflection of the woman he had loved and lost. Arthur also began to confront his past, to face the pain he had buried for so long. He visited Sarah's grave, a place he had avoided for 20 years. He spoke to her, telling her about Alara, about the daughter she had given him. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure he had never thought possible. He also started to change his behavior at work. He became more approachable, more compassionate. He delegated tasks, trusted his employees, and even started to smile. The cold, unfeeling CEO began to thaw, replaced by a man who was finally learning to live again. One evening, Arthur invited Alara to dinner at his penthouse. As they sat at the dining table overlooking the city lights, he raised his glass. "To Alara," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "To my daughter who brought me back to life." Alara smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "To you, Arthur," she replied, "to a new beginning." Arthur knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He had a lot to make up for, a lot to learn. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had Alara, his daughter, his family. And that, more than anything, gave him hope. He looked at Alara, her eyes sparkling in the candlelight, and he knew that he had finally found his way back to the warmth of human connection. He had touched a woman, not in a physical sense, but in a profound, emotional way. He had touched his daughter's heart, and in doing so, he had healed his own. The story ends with Arthur and Alara looking out at the city lights. What would you have done if you were Arthur, finding out your assistant was your daughter after 20 years of isolation? Share your thoughts below.